Hello and welcome to our interview with Xalavier Nelson. Today we're going to be talking specifically about, well, we'll be talking about El Paso elsewhere, but probably uh, maybe we can get Xalavier to talk about some of his other games. And his I was going to make the joke about the the childhood gambling simulator, but um but definitely talking about El Paso elsewhere. Xalavier is kind of the lead, the man behind the ideas at Strange Scaffolds, but also specifically his work on that we're going to be talking about today is his work on El Paso elsewhere. I'm rambling. Xalavier, how are you? Thank you for coming to talk to us today. Me and Trey, the professor of fun at USC. She demands to be called that. It's in her contract.
I do.
It's in her contract.
That's rad.
And I just want to jump in and say, I'm sorry, Xalavier, that Strange Scaffold, to me, it's so important that you're known as the company that makes better, faster, cheaper, and healthier, or makes games in a better, faster, cheaper, and healthier way, right? That is super important to the ethos of how you enter this space. So I want to throw that out there as something that I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
Yeah.
It's the motto. And thank you for raising that. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Xalavier Nelson Jr. I am tired but alive today. A lot of really cool stuff has happened around El Paso elsewhere. We've got a plushie on the way. Our vinyl is in the process of being printed. Like, the degree to which El Paso elsewhere, the little game that could, has fit within the studio's philosophy, but simultaneously been this incredibly strong entry into a year where so many strong games got made. I'm deeply proud of what the team accomplished. And it's been very busy keeping up with the game as it started to take a life of its own, with players, including people who are very, very horny for the lead protagonist.
How does that make you feel as the voice of the lead?
I personally take it as the fact that I did a strong enough performance to connect with them. You know, sometimes you connect with someone in their head, sometimes it's in their heart, and sometimes it's in their pants. And you know, if you can get all three, that's the trifecta.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, hey, the game has released, to, like, I don't know if it was surprising to you, but such strong critical praise. And I just so you have the critical praise. And of course it wouldn't be surprising because I'm sure when you were working on this, you knew it was dope. You knew it was gonna like land in just a way. But you
thought
have
it would get 6s and 7s though.
You did.
Did you really?
Because the video games industry is in a very weird place. We knew that we had made something that we were incredibly proud of and that stood not just as a really strong Black game, but on its own as a worthy voice to the legacy of what Max Payne was laying down, right? We started with Max Payne as an inspiration point and quickly put rocket boosters onto our own take of what it means to not just do noir, but neo-noir. What does it mean to tell a story with bullet time, with style, flair, and neon lighting? The thing about where games is currently, though, is we have been hit by the escalationist thinking that's striking every industry right now. The importance is not on the strength of your idea and its execution. There is the additional invisible modifier of, but was enough money put into it though? How big was the budget? How long is the playtime? A game that is going to change your life in 2 hours, even if it will be stretched beyond its ability to have that impact if it's 20, the current wave of discussion culturally in both the game development and, to a degree, the game playing sector is, give me the 20-hour game. Give me the biggest game possible. And if the game gets harmed in the process, we don't have the vocabulary to discuss how very specific development decisions, like if you have voice acting or not, ends up altering what type of story you can tell best. So we knew we had brought something really strong to the table, and we were really proud of the soundtrack and the story and the gameplay and what all of the people who have touched this game have done to bring it into full and roaring life. But we also know that we're hitting an industry where we made a bunch of really specific choices, including sometimes saying, yes, this will make the game bigger or more expensive, but it won't make the game better. We had made all of those really intentional choices, and the idea of making those choices feels like, rather than it being the hand of the artist shaping the best experience for players, a lot of people see that as compromise. You aren't making the theoretical quote unquote best version of your game. So I had set expectations up front leading up to launch of, y'all, we've done something really special here, but 8s, 9s, and 10s are often reserved not necessarily for artistic execution, but for pure scale, scope, and overall budget. That's not to impinge on the creative efforts that are also happening there, but you can see a pretty clear difference between the games that get 6s and 7s and often years later get retrospectives of, man, that really did something special though. Yeah. And the 8s, 9s, and 10s that we forget. So when the game landed, and it landed an hour before reviews did, we were kind of just like, yep, okay. We're really proud of what we did, and we think that players are going to dig it. And then the reviews landed, and it was, I think the very first one was an 8, and we were like, whoa, cool. Not going to expect a lot more like that, but we got an 8. Good job, y'all. Then another 8, and then like a 9, and then a 10, and then another 9. And it was like, oh, gosh, okay.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
It felt like people saw us.
Yeah.
They saw us, and they saw our decisions, and they felt that our decisions were valid. And that was a deeply dangerous feeling, I can say, in the moment. Because as soon as you had the dopamine rush of being seen as a human being, it felt like months, if not years, of exhaustion went away in a second. And you wanted to immediately chase that dragon of, oh, I want to do that again. Let me put, because El Paso Elsewhere, especially near the end, I'll be honest, was a pretty crunchy dev cycle. It put a lot of strain on us. And the idea of, oh, but this means it was all worth it. And the temptation to say, and it will happen again if we do it all over again. I felt it in that moment, and I said, no. I said it out loud to the team. We were all on a call. I said, this is how teams end up taking 2 years making a game or 3 years making a game, and then their next year game takes 5. Because what you're craving is not just money or validation. It is being recognized as a human being who made quote unquote right choices.
So Xalavier, you mentioned it in your last response. But also when you said that, there's a plushie coming and the vinyl's being printed, I want to talk about the music, right? Because it is not extremely common that we get a game where the soundtrack is so dope that it's like another character in the game, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, and are you rapping on this? Is this you? I mean, you're doing the singing too, right?
I'm the vocalist and lyricist, yes, and thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, I mean, I was experiencing it as more like a musical at times too, because of how reflective the lyrics are, how connected they are to the character, to James, and so I'm thinking like this is a musical now too. I'm playing, watching them playing this game as that. So that important role of the commentary and the ongoing like interiority that's being showcased through the lyrics, and then to say nothing of the musical style, got hip hop, you've got rock and metal, you've got like all of these other influences or composites there.
So tell us about the music.
So we did not originally want to do that. We loved, again, the opportunity to occupy a unique voice, but the idea of doing first a hip-hop album was not on the cards. And then when we were doing a hip hop album, we were like, okay, but we aren't going to do a concept album because Deltron did that. And Deltron is legendary. And we ain't going to be Deltron, so we ain't going to try to be Deltron. And what we ended up doing was a hip hop horror concept album that was like an anthology of these dark stories instead. Yeah. So kind of being pulled kicking and screaming by what the game wanted and allowing ourselves to be challenged and to open up our artistic capabilities to what that game development process could bring out of us was an incredibly meaningful experience. I feel like I, Grinch style, had my heart grow 10 sizes doing that because I had done songwriting before. One of my favorite things to do when I do have spare time is like write pop punk lyrics or like little Sinatra style croons or whatever. I like songwriting. I like thinking about a potential story through the lens of its music. And I've done some vocal performance before, some musical performance before, often in a comedic context, which does give you that kind of layer of irony, depending on where you're doing it, to say, oh, but yeah, if it sounds bad, that's because it was a joke. I wasn't really trying. It was a joke. So to sincerely put this effort forward, have our hearts on a platter, and to do that in area after area after area, incredibly scary experience. But I'm so glad to see that it has connected with people and landed and shown what we're fully capable of. I feel like making this game was a process of learning about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get to that, because I've heard you speak about vulnerability in this game. But first, I kind of want to take a step back and talk about the story, right? Because I think you're quickly becoming, I dare I say, the only game dev that has made games that are Black love stories. Correct me if I'm wrong. Come on, correct me if I'm wrong. But now we've kind of have, you've got 2 games. All we need is a third game that's like the trilogy of Black love stories in games. And so I wonder if you could, and of course I'm referring to an airport for aliens currently run by dogs being a Black love story, a totally different feel, vibe, like, everything, aesthetic, that's one type of love story. But then this is a completely other, like, look at, what this might look like. So if you could talk to us about the story, what is happening here and how is this a love story? And then, then maybe we could get to some of these, to the topic of vulnerability and how that is clear in the story and the narrative, and then also how it relates to you and your positionality, as a creative lead here.
That's a really good set of questions. So to start, Black love stories, I mean, let's be real. The depth of Black love and the specific nuances that takes, the fact that Black love is universal, but also it has specific nuances, and the ways that both of those tend to get erased when presented in a mainstream context or in a piece of art, that's prominent and problematic. It is a struggle to find your voice authentically represented as a Black person in love in stories. So yeah, I have never thought of it through that lens, but Black love stories, Black-centric characters and protagonists who are living out quote-unquote atypical existences is something that prominently features in quite a bit of my work. And here, for those who are not familiar, El Paso Elsewhere is the story of a male relationship abuse survivor. What does it mean when your scars are not physical, but they go down to the core of who you are? And the fact that no matter what trauma you've gone through in that relationship, that doesn't mean that those feelings or that love does not remain. There's really complicated, nuanced subject material to go through. One early draft of the story had active incorporation of the type of reverse victimization that can happen in this variety of relationships. So your character in El Paso Elsewhere was previously in a relationship with the Lord of the Vampires, Dracula. this relationship turned abusive. He escaped, he survived, but not necessarily what you would call intact. And now he is having to confront his ex as perhaps the one person who can, in order to destroy the monster he loved before she ends the world, to get back the power and the influence and the full ascension of her crown and her throne that she believes she deserves. So in one early version of the story, a critical thing that's always been a piece of the narrative is that Dracula never laid a hand on him, because you don't have to lay hands on someone in order to harm them permanently.
Right.
But one piece of the story was going to be that she was going to put him in a position to, in an act of self-defense, push back. And as a result, because he had never had hands laid on him, even though he was a victim in this situation, the fact that he did anything means he can no longer see himself as innocent, and that others will not see him as innocent, and so that traps him in the relationship. This is a real relationship dynamic that occurs. It is a common story among survivors. Yeah, but the thing is, the way it was going to go down in the game is that James was going to relate this story of how one day Dracula was acting very atypical. She was literally trying to bite towards his neck, pushing him further and further back in the hotel room that they were currently in. He ended up in a corner, sticking out just his hand straight out. I was going for the most very clear recognition that this man was not trying to cause any harm. He was simply trying to keep someone away from him. And she, while trying to push against him, ended up bumping against his hands, falling backwards through a plate glass table. She would brush herself off of the glass, of the blood, never bring it up again, but that would be enough that he felt scarred and not innocent. And we could not do that because James is black and Dracula is white. And whether or not anyone would say those words out loud, I realized, ironically, the game would be proving its own point by, if James was not a quote-unquote perfect innocent victim, that people would not see him as innocent, and his blackness would play a part in it. So we removed that from the narrative before we ever went into vocals or cutscene stage. And I think it would be yet another layer of nuance to have tried to depict, but it's also illustrative of the unique things that you have to jump through and consider when you're telling a story that incorporates Black love and atypical relationship dynamics. And if you don't have Black people in that room in leadership positions, having those active considerations of those invisible elements, yeah, you can bring this up in a sensitivity read, but there's something different when it's generated by the team and considered in that very holistic manner. So Airport for Aliens Can Run by Dogs is a story of a healthy long-distance relationship. This neo-noir tragedy is a story of a relationship that's gone wrong, and how that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't love someone still. Well, and of course, also you shoot a bunch of monsters. So
the literal demons of this relationship. I mean, you're confronted with the literalization of this relationship's darkest, places, right? You're in the literal dark place of the surrealist, like, hotel horror, horror scene. And then you're fighting those demons that are like the manifestations of all of these complicated dynamics.
You can get really deep into metaphor on this game if you so choose. And one of my favorite pieces of that metaphorical dynamic is to go to the second piece of your question. Yes, this game has a lot of me in it. I'm the lead voice actor, I'm the lead vocalist, I'm doing design and writing and all sorts of other stuff. I'm going into the game and adjusting positions of things and levels. The idea, though, that you see in El Paso Elsewhere, a game that it contains a lot of my voice and a lot of specific skills I'm demonstrating, but also this character isn't me, and this situation is not exactly true to me, and that kind of weird. It invites natural questions of how much of this is true to life. One of the first things that happened when someone, a friend of mine, bought the game on launch day, played it all the way through, and then he called me and he said, "Hey, so who hurt you?"
No, dude, do we need to talk as friends? You know, like, do you need that support as well?
And that's been a really interesting dynamic of, well, one, it's for a lot of people on the team been demonstrating new skills or pushing yourself into new territory or telling a complicated story or a game or having a gameplay style that is close to a legendary entry or franchise in the games industry. All of those things can add a layer of stress and anxiety on top of the normal difficulty of developing a video game. But the specific dynamic I encountered on the team of, well, dang, yes, there's a lot of emotional truth here. Some life experiences I've had do inform this, but also I still talk to every ex that I've ever had. I'm on good terms with these people. Seeing game reviews, sometimes even actively speculate on past relationships and partners and how I feel about that and what this game represents as a piece of art as relating to me. For lack of a better term, it's weird. It's weird, and I knew it would happen, but it's still weird. And
well, minimum,
it introduces interesting conversations.
And I was just going to say that for a game to represent you, it doesn't have to autobiographically represent you, right? It can represent these other aspects of your interiority, these sort of more meta themes and issues, that you as a Black man sort of grapple with. And I definitely think, your anecdote about the development process and having, being a part of that there and saying, oh, we can't put James in this situation, because he's Black, right? That's also speaking from an experience, an experiential space of you, right? And so like be able to make those decisions, even though it doesn't translate literally to like we're playing your life. It's still a big part of you. It's still a big part of the things that you care about, the conversations that you want to have, this topic of vulnerability and masculinity and vulnerability and Black masculinity, and violence and all kinds of things that don't have to have a literal translation to, who you are, but still really, really sincerely and importantly apply.
Yeah, it allows for all of its difficulties. It at minimum means that your game can speak to people in more ways, and there are paths through which El Paso Elsewhere aped Max Payne and other entries in the genre like Dead to Rights and the Die Hard trilogy and stuff. There's other things we could have aped more directly. It might have even resulted in more sales as well, as much as the game has done well for itself.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways that we could have taken this character and made it easier on ourselves, frankly. Not having him be Black, not telling the story of a male survivor of abuse and some of the unique dynamics there, taking on traditional conceptions of masculinity and victimhood. But also, I'm now getting DMs from people which are deeply personal about ways that they have been able to be seen by this game, ways that they have been able to understand things about themselves and about their relationship that they're currently in because they played a video game where you shoot werewolves in a haunted hotel. And to me, to have that game have that kind of impact and tackle as many things as it has and sell copies and have a life beyond the pure bounds of the game itself with stuff like this vinyl and so on, I feel like El Paso Elsewhere was an unabashed creative success and something I am honored to be a part of.
That's what that was a question I was going to ask, right? As we were talking about vulnerability and this kind of challenge to Black masculinity in some very real ways. I applaud you for taking that on, right? Because that is often what we don't get to see, right? We don't get to see the ways that Black men can be victimized in romantic relationships as well. Because again, that's kind of that danger zone. It's like, well, if you were a real man, that would not have happened, kind of thing, right? And it warms my heart to be able to see Black men as human beings, right? Living, breathing, feeling human beings that are able to be victims and still be Black men, right?
Yeah.
And
the fact that you have been harmed does not make you less of a hero or less of a man or less worth living.
Or less Black, right? Less Black. Because there's this idea that, Blackness itself can't be victimized because we're not human, right? So that isn't even possible. So I think that, it doesn't make you any less.
And the intersectional nature of like Black manhood, right? And how that kind of just resonates and becomes deeper, right? With being able to see how all of these things come into play together.
So I would love to know what the conversations were like when, you introduced this idea for this game to your team and you're like, it's going to tackle all this, really dark, intense stuff, and it's going to be about vampires and werewolves. And like, what was that call like? Was that par for the course? We do have an airport, run by aliens, or an airport for dogs currently run by aliens. We do have that. So maybe it's not too out there, but it's not necessarily the like sci-fi aspects or the neo-noir aspects. I mean, I just think thematically, like games tackle serious issues all the time, but not necessarily in this kind of package, so I just kind of wonder, what were those was everybody like, oh yeah, I'm there, for this exploration of vulnerability and domestic violence and race and all of it?
So I am increasingly convinced that belief is the lifeblood of a video game development process. You need your team to believe in you as a creative director and a studio head and lead. You need to believe in your game and what it's telling you and what it wants to be. You need to look across the table at publishers and platform holders, and they need to believe in your ability to release something special, and your ability to not just release something special, but make something that will make them back their money. There's all of these really fragile, unseen structures of belief, to a degree under-discussed structures of belief, and without them, the game doesn't get made. And I'd say one thing I'm deeply grateful to the team for is when I do come forward with a concept like this, I can actually, if it would be useful for the Black Game Archive, share with you the original pitch and the text for the pitch for the game.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
The very first thing written for it is, I'm going to read it out real quick. Wide shot. The camera pans through an environment littered with dead, monstrous bodies. It's an aged hotel. A man in a long brown trench coat with a tragic face stands in an old elevator with a handgun in both hands. The doors slam shut. Would you believe that this is a love story? And the would you believe that this is a love story is in quotes because it was at least conceived for some time as the very first things you hear playing this game. When I presented this forward, or all sorts of the games that we've made to date and are making, the degree to which my team has entrusted me with their faith to just say, okay, so here's how we make it. As I ask those questions, rather than being like, ooh, do we want this to be a Black guy? I get the honor of having pretty implicit faith from my team members and from my production and infrastructure team for the games that we make and the games that I pitch internally. And it's something I am deeply aware of and very careful to not take for granted.
I am so glad you made this game, and that you made this game, you know, have a Black protagonist in it, because, you know, you get very quickly to those conversations about respectability, even that, like, okay, we already have limited representation, Black representation in the industry on the development side, you know, the artistic side, but also in terms of in front of the, you know, on the screen, in terms of the representational side of who you're playing. And so because of those realities, it can be very tempting to say, we've got to have like the perfect situation or the perfect hero or the perfect set of themes. I don't know. It's got to be about Black utopia, which, look, I am all down with Black. Like, let's find Black utopia. Let's get there. I want that. I
struggled with that because he's like
I want
an
that.
Addict.
Exactly. And so you're like,
and I was like, oh man, am I doing another addict? But also, I want to play. The plan was always to play him. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but like, I was just gonna say, I was like, man, I want to play this character. I want to give him complexity. I don't want him to just be a block of obsidian on which we just with like Maxim magazine written all of them, and he's like, here, Black power.
I know, no, and it gets to the age-old questions, right? That, like, do you have to have the Sidney Poitier film? You know, Sidney Poitier had an impeccable image, an endurable, you know, image for so long, enduring image, or is this blaxploitation, right? Because then we get the cycle of films that are not about that, you know, and so it can be. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be all of the above, right? It can be like there are genre traditions, thematic traditions, different kinds of contexts in which you want to see, you know, Blackness explored and live and have this. And so it doesn't have to be that, hey, you can't be a Black addict in a video game, right? You know, I mean, we have, you know, Black gangsters and criminals and all of this stuff. And the problem is when, you know, those things are not done, when they're not done in a way that has other people of color at the table to be able to say, like, add these layers of complexity. It's not like, hey, you know, Denzel Washington is so often credited for his performance in Training Day, you know, where he's just like this thug cop, and it's like he's this brutal thug cop, but Denzel Washington's played in, like, you know, 50 or 60 other movies and has a spread of different types of characters and characterizations. And I think that that's, you know, one of the things we crave for the video game industry, to continue to make, for people to continue to make stuff that gives us, you know, a more comprehensive range of, like, just imagine that, just like Black life, right? That allows people to be in whatever context, you know, werewolves, vampires, addicts, you know, heist leaders, you know, anything that you can think of. We haven't seen it yet, and so seeing it, you know, for the first time is going to add to some complexity to the history of Black innovation and interaction with the medium, you know, which is what the archive is trying to help chronicle, right, of the long history of Black engagement with video games. And you know, it's a modest effort at that, because it's actually more complex than we think. But the more we get these projects that are dynamic in their own right, you know, I think the more we're going to add complexity to the bigger picture of what this industry is and can be.
Yeah, we are multifaceted, complex beings. We are not perfect, but we are special, like all human beings. But also, we have these special pieces of our perspective and our artistic capability that come from being part of the diaspora, from our ancestry or our separation from it. We're seeing a lot of the same discussions in this intersectional way happening around more complicated stories centering around women and queer people. How do we just let people tell stories about what the human condition through frames other than brooding white guys? And it is one thing that makes me deeply grateful for this current wave of Black genre art that we're seeing today, with things like Nope and They Cloned Tyrone and Sorry to Bother You. The idea that even when Black people are up to no good, they are human beings with dignity and agency, just like the other characters that get to be represented on screen. it means a lot, and it's going to be an uphill battle to see those stories told in games because you don't have Black leadership and vision holders often in these rooms, but it's happening. And I'm grateful to see El Paso Elsewhere emerge as an entry pushing that envelope.
Absolutely. So I excuse me. I think that like having this I think of James as kind of like an anti-hero, right? So but also just kind of a real person, and having that and then having you voice James, I think is huge, right? Because I'm always big on voice acting
matters.
Yes, voice acting matters. I mean, especially like the other featured game that we're having with this update is Assassin's Creed Liberation, where Aveline, who is our first Black female assassin, is voiced by a white woman, right?
Wait, what?
Yes, she's voiced by a white woman.
I didn't know. Gosh dang it.
Yeah.
And then when you think about like all like in the same way that we're talking about all the complexity that exists in El Paso Elsewhere, when we think about all the complexity that exists in Assassin's Creed Liberation, when you're talking about enslaved folks, when you're talking about sexual servitude, when you're talking about octoroon and quadroon balls, when you're talking about like all of these things that are kind of a very real part of our history as Black people, and having that intersectional, having Aveline have that intersectional identity of not only a Black woman, not only being Black and female, but also being biracial in the specific geographical area where her servitude would have been sexualized and different from other folks' servitude, and then said, but we're going to have a white woman voice that is a very interesting choice to make.
Yeah. But, you know, not only that, I think that when you think about just this history, these other histories of like blackface and, you know, all kinds of different sets of appropriation, you know, when you get to the fundamental question of, you know, does it matter who's cast, who's either the avatar, or like what the avatar looks like, right? Is the avatar sort of a person of color or Black, or who's voicing them? You know, the answer is yes to both. It matters. It doesn't mean that a game like Assassin's Creed Liberation is still not significant in the history of Black culture and games where those things intersect. It is, but we also want to talk about, hey, you know, what you know, what happened with the voice acting decision? And I think under your direction and leadership, you know, I don't see that happening. That if James, you know, if James is Black, if you're not playing him, somebody else is gonna play him. There's gonna be a match there, and you're gonna be thoughtful about those choices. And so it's just it's reassuring, you know, to know that we're not crazy when we think, hey, that's a problem. I don't know why that happened. Hey, I want to share, I'm mindful of your time, but I want to share a quick snippet of the taxonomy for the archive that we use to kind of think about what games we select to go in. And right now, you know, we're always taking suggestions because we don't know who's worked on what. And so, you know, this is something that's going to be crowdsourced over time and is going to fill out more. And it's always a part of a conversation of what we're changing here. But for now, this is this sort of taxonomy of Blackness that we use to kind of talk through why a game is in this space, right? And so you have things like development, and development is just the process, who's involved, who's, you know, what are the different roles that people play. That's one category where a lot of people will be emailing us saying, hey, I worked on a game, I'm Black, I was the, you know, sound engineer, or I was this. And so I think because of the development category, we're going to have a lot more games that we wouldn't have even thought about, but it is a way of acknowledging Black labor in the industry. So it's not developers, you know, it includes everything, all the roles that you might play in making a game. And obviously in the case of El Paso Elsewhere, development is related. Development, you get get the check mark there. Voice acting, absolutely. And it's actually voice acting and motion capture, because a lot of times Black bodies might be used as the motion capture, and then maybe the voice acting doesn't mirror that. But in your case, absolutely. Mechanics.
As a fun fact,
go for it.
Every character in the game, their animations are all either based on video of me or like images taken for what their poses would be. So like I quote unquote played Dracula. I played James. I've got video imagery. Ooh, I might just have to share this with you instead of with the archive as a whole. But I've got imagery of like leaping around a living room barefoot to like and talking about the mechanics of how we wanted the werewolf to make, and the werewolf's animations are me. They're me jumping across my room.
Yeah, no, I love it. And look, we want to have a physical repository at an actual museum like the Smithsonian, the Strong Museum for Games. The Black Games Archive is going to have a physical repository as well, and maybe like a curated sort of themed exhibit. And so a lot of the stuff that you're offering, do not worry. We're going to circle back to you about some of this stuff to go in these, places, because you've got to archive and collect and document this history. It's ephemeral otherwise, right? People move on, they lose their notes or something. So hang on to everything and donate it to the Black Games Archive in whatever way you feel best represents your work. But we want to have it here and have it in other physical esteemed spaces of historical archiving. So mechanics, right? Like in Assassin's Creed Liberation, you're like changing into a slave. That's a mechanic that, kind of reverberates backwards. But I think that we think that probably if you're playing a Black character, that most of the things that you're going to do that's interesting mechanically have to resonate. Like what is a Black mechanic? That's like a rich kind of theoretical question. But in the case of your game, I was thinking, hey, bullet time in this context, the slow down motion, that's really important, and it is related to like Black life and culture and history, because it's something called chronopolitics of like how time does not move in the same way for Black people, right? Like we always think of time as progressive, like we're always moving forward, but when we talk about histories of oppression and tools of oppression, like this is why people can say, how is this still happening in 2023, right? I thought we as a society progressed past the point of these, awful accounts of police brutality or whatever. No, because time doesn't function in the same way for marginalized and oppressed people. So when you have a mechanic like bullet time.
Wow.
Oh yeah, no, it's dope, right? So if you have a mechanic like bullet time and you're James and James is played by you, in that context of all of these other things that we've already said, of course it's mechanically relevant and significant because it's in that context of playing this character and this character's story.
And it's interesting
I love the slow down mechanics. Anytime there's a slowdown or some kind of way of tweaking the way time works or intervening in the way time works, and you're Black, that's always relevant.
It's so interesting because it's kind of a revisioning of because I remember, like the early Max Payne games and bullet time, right? So it's kind of that interesting revisioning of bullet time. And that slowdown in Max Payne when the body that is doing these actions, that is doing these mechanics is visibly raced, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's super interesting to think about it in those ways.
So you're getting the mechanics, mechanics are relevant. Narrative themes, yes, definitely. Politics, ideology, history, that's just a way of sort of trying to situate it's like the game's politics, I think, too, right? The game's sort of like political orientation and progressiveness, and I think that applies. Playable Black characters, yes. As far as I could tell, I couldn't see playable or Black NPCs in the world, but maybe I'm wrong.
There is a Black hostage archetype. So
okay, I was gonna say maybe in the hostages, the
NPCs, you don't usually look at them too much because they're flinching and down below and they're trying not to get eaten. But there's a little bit of color there too.
Intersectionality, absolutely. Black cultural traditions, come on, yes, right on. You got a vinyl coming, and like, you know, so there's that.
Also in the vinyl notes, we include, instead of liner notes having like interviews or anything, it's actually an epilogue set shortly after the events of the game where you get to read James Savage's diary. I just linked that to y'all. You'll be able to. I'm not sure of the exact legal stuff around that, so you'll probably have to, especially if you're presenting it in esteemed institutions, pick up a copy of the vinyl and pull out the liner notes. But one of the things that's something I really felt was important was the idea of James having to learn how to buy sunscreen because his family never had it. Because my family didn't have it. I don't have that in my
This archive is sponsored by Black Girl Sunscreen, right? That stuff is great. It doesn't leave that like white sheen on your face, and it like actually blends it. Oh my God, it's so good. It's $23 a tube. But being in LA and being like that the sun is always here, I'm especially like lathering up, and I just bought it in bulk, and it's so good.
You have to have sunscreen with no zinc in it.
Yeah, Black Girl. I think it's called Black Girl Sunscreen. I got a
Black
whole bunch
Girl
of
Sunscreen. I found it.
I'm in my bathroom.
I'm literally adding it to my like.
They have billboards here that say it's always fucking sunscreen season, right? Like with the black person on it being like, it's always sunscreen season, which is a great public service announcement also. So intersectionality, cultural traditions, yes, there's obviously no character creation, and sometimes there are robust, you know, repurposing and storytelling and things that go along with that. So that's not there. The fandom community reception component is really like, is there a critical like Black discourse community? Like, do Black players or, you know, journalists and writers like come to the table to talk about the significance or, you know, the community around, is there a community that it forms around this game? And this just having come out, it might not happen yet, but it is happening. I mean, like I'm seeing lots of traction in this regard, so it'll probably have that. And then mods, I'm sure you can't look forward, you can't wait for there to be mods potentially of this space. So that might happen. Anti-Blackness and regressive characterizations is just a way for us to flag when we think that games are pretty racist and problematic, but they might have some of these other things, like they might appropriate Black culture and show up in the archive because they're doing some of these other things. Maybe they have a playable Black character, right? But then it's like a really kind of bogus set of circumstances and meanings behind it. So no, you don't want that to be checked for you. But just in looking at like these 13, you know, ways of trying to investigate and explore really and have a good conversation about why a game might be in this space. I mean, El Paso Elsewhere is going to hit on with a good deal of this landscape, right? Which is really makes it a really sort of rich cultural document to be able to discuss and play.
I'm so excited to hear that.
Yeah, right on. Okay, so anyhow, that's it. We're mindful that you're busy doing all kinds of projects, I'm sure, and then working on the next great thing, the next entry in the trilogy of Black Love, the Black Love trilogy I'm putting out there. And then the only other thing I want to say that I say to every Black person in games is, when is the Octavia Butler game coming? I know that someone in this space, in this community, is going to make an Octavia Butler
They're
video
saving
game,
it for you, Trey.
Either about Kindred or the Parable series. It could be on anything. Invite me to be an advisor to the project or something. I like, hey, got lots to say and lots of directions to point. But I know that someone that you know, because the circle is small, is going to make the Octavia Butler game. So I just put that there, you know, as like goodwill for when that happens.
I hope we can manifest it, because that would be amazing.
Yes, absolutely.
Xalavier, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Two things. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about your game and to talk about your work. It has been an amazing conversation. The other thing that I want to throw out there, that I like to throw out there for folks, is there anything that you want to add that we didn't talk about today that you think needs to be kind of preserved in the archive?
I think if I had to think of anything to be preserved for archival purposes specifically, I think one of the most important things to recognize here is how many people's belief went into the game. So this game doesn't happen without the humble Black Game Dev Fund and the people who advocated for us to be a part of that. This game doesn't happen without Xbox with the Developer Acceleration Program, not just supporting us to bring the game to Xbox, but once we were there, putting us on the dashboard. When people booted up their Xbox, they saw El Paso Elsewhere because other people believed in it. The idea that Black artistry is uplifted by Black people is why so many Black artists are freaking exhausted all the time, because you're expected to do all of this work to uplift the entire thing, and then people come in and say, yeah, this is good, we need more of this. Clapping behind you as you're lifting that burden. So El Paso Elsewhere almost didn't exist. The studio nearly closed down right after the game shipped because of ways that our perspective was not seen as ambitious enough. Better, faster, cheaper, healthier, as a very lower middle class kid, seemed to me that it made us a sane, consistent, high quality bet. And what that spoke to from a certain other, let's call it privileged perspective, was, oh, then you don't want to aim high. It's like, no, I want to aim high and not destroy people in the process, because that means we can keep aiming high. So the studio nearly closed in the process of shipping it. That was a really big lift. And also, we couldn't have done that lift without other people. This is a story of a lot of people believing in Strange Scaffold's perspective and in the story of James Savage. So the fact is that Black art cannot exist in games as it currently exists right now without significant pain and the explicit work and advocacy of people who are across the privilege and marginalization spectrum. If this does impact quite a few of the stories that come to being, because I can almost guarantee you that a Black person was not involved when Aveline did not get cast as a Black person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just wanted to call out how many support structures we've had, formal and informal. We put a lot of those people in the special thanks, but Black art doesn't happen if white people, if intersectional advocates do not stand up and advocate for it, because even if it does occur, then it just won't be seen. So as a community in game development, even our players, we are all responsible for making sure we get better video games created in a more sustainable way. And we're uniquely empowered right now to make that change. So thank you in the Black Game Archive for documenting that history as well, because it is what allows video games to exist.